Okay, can you all see it? I assume.
Yeah.
All right, so let me get started. Good morning, everybody. I hope the discussions are going great. Thank you so much for being here. I want to thank my fellow panelists, Ben, Hillary, Caris, for managing this. I also want to give a special thanks to the conference organizers for accommodating this panel. Their flexibility is very much appreciated. Curiously, the circumstances that prevented me from joining in person pertain to the context that is relevant for this presentation and that Caris started introducing in her opening, right? So we are reaching the end of a decade in which we witnessed the rise and the consolidation of authoritarianism across the globe. Governments that have, among other measures, eroded checks and balances, attacked civil society organizations, restricted protest and immigration, targeted universities and the media, intensified the criminalization of dissent, and increasingly relied on emergency measures and exceptional powers. So we know this picture, right? Unfortunately. And in the US, although certainly not only that there, the executive branch has become a central vehicle for for implementing the contemporary right-wing project, often in ways that seek to hollow out institutions from within, right? And in response, what I will call here from the progressive sector, right, for lack of a better term, the progressive sector has increasingly turned its attention towards rebuilding institutional power, right? So this represents a notable shift, I would say, from the first half of the 2010s, when many of the most visible movements tended to approach institutions primarily through critique, if not outright rejection, right? And while this progressive response certainly includes engagement at the federal level, some of the most ambitious efforts have emerged really at the local level, right? So particularly in cities, in states. I call these efforts ambitious because these efforts do not simply resist attacks, but they also present themselves as alternative political projects that try to transform the relationship between residents and officials, and more fundamentally, the ways that cities are run, right? And for sure, the elections of progressive figures such as Michelle Wu in Boston, Brandon Johnson in Chicago are important examples, right? Because they advance policies around climate change, labor rights, public education, social investment, etc. What I have in mind is something broader than the election of left-wing officials, right? What interests me is a re-emergent effort, let's say, to reimagine governance itself through new forms of participation, co-governance, and community power, right? We can see elements of this tendency in initiatives associated with Council member Kendra Brooks in Philadelphia, and perhaps more in the spotlight today in the vision advanced by Zora Mandani in New York, right? So these projects seek not only to implement progressive policies, but also expand the capacity of ordinary residents to shape public priorities, participate in decision-making, and exercise influence over institutions that have traditionally remained distant from popular control, right? So the central question here is not simply really who governs, but how governing institutions can be reorganized right? And giving ordinary residents a more sustained role in shaping public decisions. So, taken together, these developments suggest what we might call a new re-emerging municipalist moment. And municipalism certainly has both a recent and a more distant past in the US and elsewhere, and I leave this history to Ben. Instead, what I want to explore, what I want to do here is to revisit a historical a historical case. Oh, sorry. Here. Wait. Yes. A historical case widely celebrated as an example of building power at the local level, which is participatory budgeting in Brazil. And for sure, much has been written about this initiative, right? But looking back from our present moment, right? What can we highlight today, right? Um, from this experience to illuminate and elevate the current municipalist moment, right? So just for more contextualization here, right? Participatory budgeting emerged in Porto Alegre, Brazil in 1989, following the election of the Workers' Party to municipal government. So the process combined neighborhood and thematic assemblies, elected delegates and councillors, and also there was a system through which residents deliberated over priority for public investment. So through an annual cycle of meetings, proposals moved from neighborhood and district to citywide negotiations, ultimately influence significant portions of the municipal budget. So roughly 9 to 21% of the city budget was allocated to citizen-driven projects throughout the years, throughout this more than 20 years of participatory budgeting. So participatory budgeting created an institutional channel through which ordinary residents could exercise sustained influence over public spending decisions regarding infrastructure, health, urban mobility, education, and other essential service. And there was also mechanisms for holding public officials accountable. So a highly celebrated aspect of Porto Alegre's participatory budgeting is that meetings were open to the public, so every resident could attend neighborhood assemblies, deliberate over priorities, and eventually become really a delegate in the budgeting process. But what is usually missed in the conversation is that the proposal for participatory budgeting was one component of a broader political project pursued by the Workers' Party and its allies during Brazil's redemocratization. So the goal was to transform really the relationship between the state and society to actually make the state a fundamental driver of social change, democratize public administration, and really establish the left as a credible governing alternative, right, for the entire country. So this broader project depended heavily on the mobilization of social movements, neighborhood associations, unions, and other grassroots organizations that emerged during the struggle against the dictatorship. And yet, while the proposal for participatory budgeting emerged from collective mobilization, the institutionalization gradually shifted the center of participation from organizations to individuals, right? So participation remained open and often inclusive, but political engagement increasingly took place through the direct involvement of individual residents in assemblies and forums rather than through collective actors that acted as intermediaries. So as a result, right, the expansion of participation was accompanied by a weakening of the organizational forms that had originally generated and sustained the demand for it. And I am happy to elaborate on the reasons behind this shift in this discussion. For now, though, what matters, I think, it's the political consequences, right? So as participation became increasingly centered on individual citizens, participatory budgeting became easier to detach from the broader project that had originally sustained it. So the procedure traveled, but the redistributive commitments that had originally that was part of it, or even the administrative reforms that made the experiment consequential did not travel, right? So this transformation opened the door for participatory budgeting to be reframed as a set of democratic best practices and governance techniques, right? So, and not surprisingly, this is precisely the moment when participatory budgeting expanded rapidly within Brazil and across the globe during the late 1990s and the early 2000s. So international agencies promoted it as a model of good governance. Governments of very different political orientations adopted participatory budgeting. And participatory budgeting became part of a broader wave of innovations that included citizen juries, deliberative polls, town halls, public consultations, online forums, and many other mechanisms that were designed to increase citizen participation. But most of these innovations lacked the broader institutional architecture that had given participation real leverage in Porto Alegre. So they invited citizens into processes while often leaving untouched the deeper structures of power. And this is what I called the paradox of community power, right? So participation expanded precisely as the capacity of participation to shape fundamental political decisions narrowed. So citizens may be invited to participate more frequently, more often than before, but the most consequential decisions affecting collective life still remain outside the scope of popular control, right? So participation can influence a small portion of public resources while leaving broader questions of policing, housing, zoning, transportation, climate, economic development, or public investment more generally, largely insulated from people's intervention, right? And of course, the analysis of participatory budgeting in different places from, Europe, the US, and even Latin America, Chicago, New York, Cordoba, etc., show that these processes, even though they might be narrow, they are not meaningless or just symbolic, right? Because many generate important spillover effects, right? They push residents to develop skills, to build relationships, to launch pressure campaigns, to pursue collective projects elsewhere, etc., right? But I will say that these possibilities, they should not obscure the larger contradiction that I'm talking about here, right? Which is participation has often expanded without corresponding expansion of popular power. So, and then bringing this back to the present moment, right? That's the legacy that the current municipalist wave is inheriting, right? So I think that this actually raises the following question: how to confront this scenario in which participation is potentially large and yet transformation is short, right? So to begin, right, I will say that we have to stop fetishizing participation, right? So participation by itself tells us very little. So participation is really not a predefined category whose effects can be assumed in advance, right? So in other words, put it simply here, participation is neither inherently co-opted nor inherently liberatory, right? So the political significance of participation depends on the broader project in which it is embedded and the forms of power that it is able to influence. And this is important because, once again, what made participatory budgeting in Porto Alegre distinctive was not participation alone, right? Porto Alegre was different because participation was tied to a redistributive commitment that generated visible material gains in the lives of working people, right? So participation mattered because it shaped outcomes that matter. So this is one, right? But then moving a little bit further, I think that commitments alone, they are not sufficient, right? So by considering Porto Alegre again, we see that the commitment to redistribution requires institutional forms capable of translating popular demands into public action, right? So, and then here, right, thinking about lessons for the present or finding easily transportable recommendations is a little bit difficult because political conditions vary considerably across places, right? So each city has its own history, its own balance of political forces, institutional constraints, and the political landscape more broadly, right? So as a result, there is no universal formula. Still, right, a few good principles or good practices emerge, right? So participatory processes should actively reach those who are usually excluded, circulate information broadly and transparently, foster shared analysis rather than merely collect preferences, and need to support participants in understanding larger systems of governance and the connections that the systems have in their lives. There is a pedagogical component here, right? But stopping at designing, good meetings, etc. This is actually like we should not stop at designing. Right? Stopping at design is dangerous. So better or more productive meetings alone don't produce a popular power, right? So and now here, I think we need to also remember that several cities, because of this wave of the late 1990s and the early 2000s, several cities already possess some participatory infrastructure, even if this infrastructure is weak, is fragmented, is under-resourced, and is disconnected from meaningful decision-making authority. So from my perspective, I think the task is less about creating new participatory venues today and more about coordinating, strengthening, and empowering the existing ones. So, and then to wrap up, I think I want to bring a broader reflection here because even then, right, even if we think about design and even if we think about a new strengthening the weak infrastructure that we already have and give it more, more connections, meaningful connections with the decision-making process. I think that even then, these efforts cannot fully resolve the limitations of individual-based participation, right? Because participation requires time, energy, skills, and resources that are unequally distributed throughout society. So individual-based participation inevitably generates challenges of representation, coordination, exhausted, and fragmentation. So, and I think that this is where the original vision, right, of participatory budgeting offers another important lesson, right? As I said earlier, right? At first, the process in Porto Alegre was not imagined as solely a direct relationship between isolated citizens and the state, right? The process reserved a role for social movements, neighborhood associations, unions, other grassroots organizations that could cultivate political capacity, sustain engagement over time, aggregate demands, connect everyday concerns to broader political struggles, right? So I think this invites us, right, to question the assumption that participation is strongest when it bypasses intermediary organizations. So I want to advance the idea that in practice, collective actors often make participation more democratic rather than less, right? So rather than obstacles to participation, then they may be among its most essential preconditions, right? Since they are able to distribute the burdens of engagement and leadership, to transform individual grievances in collective demands, and they really help connect the dots that are necessary for systemic change, right? So I think that if the paradox of community power emerges when participation expands and collective power declines, right? So then the challenge today is not simply to create more opportunities for participation, right? I think the challenge is to build to rebuild the collective infrastructures that allow participation to become a meaningful vehicle for power rather than a merely mechanism of consultation, right? And I think the emergence here of new institutions making up a new system. And I think that social movements and collective organizations are going to be essential in this endeavor. And we need to have a reserved place for them in this new moment of local power. Thank you, folks.
So much, Nara. That's great. So we'll go straight on to you, Ben.
All right, very good. I'm so pleased to be following Nara Roberta because what you just shared resonated with me, in part because it resonated with me in terms of my own personal experience with.
Sorry, just one moment. Can you all hear okay? Yeah, it's okay. It's a little bit muffled. I don't know if there's, maybe mic.
Unfortunately, I'm operating off of earbuds.
Okay.
So I will try to speak more slowly. Does that help?
Yeah. This thing. Yeah, I think. Say something, Ben.
Check.
Okay, cool.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Thanks for interrupting me.
Okay,
I appreciate that. Yeah, do let me know if it's a problem. Feel free to interrupt again. And yes, it really is my pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you so much, Karis and Simon and others on hand for enabling our participation from afar. Happy to talk with folks about that, at another point in terms of what's going on here in the States. And that will actually be part of the remarks as Nara Roberta was saying. And what I was saying earlier was just that your comments, Nara, spoke to my own experience with our early efforts to bring participatory budgeting to the United States, 2001, 2002. We organized a conference in Madison, Wisconsin, and we ran into sort of an effort to depoliticize participatory budgeting as it was being introduced, to remove political parties, to remove unions, to remove social movement organizations from the process, and that was it's nice to be validated in terms of our of where at least I was coming from and others I worked with were coming from in those debates. My remarks have to do with what's happening in the United States right now, and I just want to give all of you a sense of where I'm coming from. I direct a program called Next System Studies at George Mason University, which is the largest public university in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And Next System Studies involve the study of the relationships between system design, both the current system and alternative systems, systemic movements, which is to say movements that are seeking system change, crises of systems, systemic crises, which is to say crises that, if left unaddressed, will inevitably produce the collapse of the system, and system change, which is to say the pathways through which systems change. So that's my larger work, and I'm happy to talk with everybody here about that, working with many other people, during the discussion. But what I'm here to speak to specifically is what's been happening here in the United States since January of 2025. And these are images from Los Angeles from just over a year ago. The last year, we saw the beginning of a named and literal blitz against American cities, cities in the United States. And it began with major deployments of militarized police under the name of ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, into Baltimore, Los Angeles, New Orleans, New York, Portland, Oregon, Washington, D.C., and many other cities, smaller cities. And of course, as probably most of you know, they were met with resistance just about everywhere. There was then an escalation that took place at the end of the summer into the early fall that was called Operation Midway Blitz. And Chicago became the main focal point of that attack. They were focused heavily in California, but of course, California was not hospitable terrain for them. And so they went after Chicago, which proved to be even less hospitable for reasons that have to do with the long history of community organizing and let's just say community power in Chicago. And then, of course, as the world knows, they went from Chicago, and for reasons that I think we can articulate, but that don't make much sense, they decided to target the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul of Minnesota, perhaps thinking that somehow they could gain traction with the heartland of the United States. But the political traditions and again the history and capacities of people in Minnesota and Wisconsin, Michigan, these states are not to be taken lightly. So I'm not going to get into detail about everything that went on in the past year and that it's actually happening right now. I should mention that just yesterday there were reports out of the Twin Cities that Department of Justice has begun arresting people who are involved with community defense work in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And so we may be moving into another period of sort of heightened contention around not only sort of the hunting down of people who are considered to be undocumented, but also of those who have been actively involved in defending their communities. Of course, the response was pretty massive. This is an image from Chicago, Illinois. Actually, the image behind me as well is also from Chicago from this past fall. And the response came in many different forms. It came in terms of neighborhoods coming out with, for example, it's estimated somewhere between 80 and 100,000 people in the city of Chicago joining neighborhood-based defense groups. So you talk about sort of this self-organized, spontaneous mobilization that took place in Chicago last fall, but also, a very significant role that was played by unions and labor councils and environmental justice organizations, all kinds of groups, and of course mayors. So that's Brandon Johnson, the mayor of Chicago, former organizer with the Chicago Teachers Union. You have Michelle Wu, who is referenced the bottom right. You have Mayor Baraka of Newark. You have Mayor Wilson of Seattle in the bottom left corner, and of course, Mamdani in New York. So to some extent, this has contributed to the return of municipal socialism to the public stage in the United States. And we've seen that, most recently in New York City and Seattle, of course, with Democratic Socialists of America members and activists. It should be important to recognize that these are people who come out of the ranks. They are not simply endorsed Democratic Party politicians who have been elected mayor of major cities. And in doing that, they joined cities that already had socialist mayors, and Boston, Chicago, Jackson, Mississippi, Newark, which I mentioned earlier. And as was mentioned earlier, through the Democratic primary, which just took place in Washington, D.C., which is right on my doorstep, or I'm on their doorstep, it looks like D.C. will be electing a socialist mayor as well. And then in Los Angeles, there will be a runoff between a DSA candidate and the incumbent mayor, who herself was in leadership of the Venceremos brigades in the 1970s. So this is quite a shift for the United States. It's not that there haven't been socialist mayors in recent decades, but we have not lived, there are few alive who have lived in periods in which there were so many major cities that were governed by really left socialist mayors in coalition with members of city councils. But let's go back to the history, just for anybody who is a bit unclear. The history of municipal socialism, of municipalism in the United States is quite deep and significant. I spent most of my life in the state of Wisconsin, grew up in Madison, Wisconsin. And of course, Milwaukee, Wisconsin was the first city to elect a Socialist Party mayor, first major city in the United States to do that. And the Socialist Party governed in Milwaukee until 1960. When I was co-chair of the Green Party of the United States, and we had our Green National Convention in Milwaukee in 2004, the last socialist mayor, Zeidel, was our chair for the convention. So there's a legacy there. But of course, it goes back much further to the early 19th century, so the early 1800s, later 18th century, turn of the century, into the 20th century. And I'm going to just give you a little bit of a sense of that, just to recognize that municipal socialism in particular is a particular kind of approach to community power, has deep roots in the US. Some would say that the oldest socialist parties in the world were organized in the United States, with the working men's parties in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Boston, and New York City in the late 1820s and early 1830s. And if you look at their rhetoric, you look at their policy platforms, and you look at sort of the methods through which they organized, I think you'd be hard pressed to characterize them as anything else. There was a bit of a lag until the later part of the 19th century, and that lag had to do with a struggle over abolition and slavery, which became the dominant concern in the United States. And go into that another time. But during the period of Reconstruction, you saw the sort of next wave of municipal socialism in the U.S. with the Knights of Labor, the National Labor Union, the United Labor Party, the Socialist Labor Party, which again has been characterized as the first organized Marxist party in the world, with Daniel De Leon and others. They won municipal power all across the country. There's a reason why International Workers' Day has its origins in Chicago in the 1880s. The next wave began in 1897 with the formation of the Cooperative Commonwealth of America, which then became the Socialist Party, the Progressive Party in my home state of Wisconsin, the American Labor Party in New York City, the Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota, and a few adjoining states all had government power at the municipal level. Then with the new left into the 1990s, what we call the long 60s in the United States, you saw all kinds of more participatory forms of this project emerge out of the Economic Research Action Project, the Black Panther Party. You saw the various people's republics of the 1970s, Somerville, Tacoma Park, Madison, Berkeley, in which there were municipal parties that were formed in the 1970s that sort of prefigured sort of the independent politics of later. The DC Statehood Party in DC, which was quite transformative in terms of leaving a longer term legacy. The election of Black socialist mayors in the 1980s. Importantly, Harold Washington, Marion Barry, Harold Washington in Chicago, Marion Barry in DC, and David Dinkins in New York City. Let's not forget. 1990s into 2010s, the Green Party, the New Party, Socialist Alternative in Seattle, and the Working Families Party all had success. I was involved significantly in the New Party in the 1990s. The Green Party I've been active with since 1990. The Greens have elected thousands of people to local office and had sort of their greatest strength maybe about 20 years ago in the US at the municipal level. And then more recently, we're in this period in which, with the strength of the Democratic Socialists of America and the emergence of radical municipalism, deeply influenced by social ecology, the emergence of the solidarity economy movement in the United States, and also a sort of a more political turn in terms of the deliberative democracy world, where there's an expansion of charter and assembly reform, popular assembly reform efforts that are taking place across the U.S. So, this is not, there are deep roots to this in the U.S. that we can get into. I want to turn to sort of the more recent period and recognize that we have been through a very intense period of struggle in the U.S. Since the late 1990s, since the so-called Seattle moment, and point to a few of the more recent roots of community power. So in the 1980s into the 2000s, you saw municipalities stepping in to take on international questions in a more significant way than they had perhaps before, what we call municipal foreign policy. You also saw forms of municipal civil disobedience. And of course, the efforts to use municipal governance to achieve and assist community liberation, and also different forms of green governance. There are many examples of this I could give from this time period. But it's basically a period in which municipalities are instrumentalized by the movement and seen as a way to exercise power at a time in which, in the United States, the democratic forces don't have national power in any significant way. From the 2000 teens into this current period, I think what you've seen is a repoliticization of municipalism, right? So municipalism is starting to become a force for itself, not just in itself. You've seen the rise of solidarity economies, of assemblies of various kinds, and of course, the mainstreaming of socialism in American life. And again, many, many different kinds of projects around community wealth building, around participatory planning, around building up regional solidarity economies, around just transition and land back, all kinds of projects in every part of the country that have been taking place. So it's out of this that this new possibility of community power has emerged. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just to recognize that I think that if we were to theorize what the sources of the community power, have been, what the sources are, and that people are sort of weaving together. One of those, to be frank, is organized labor, despite the fact that labor unions are at their lowest level of union density in generations in the United States. What unions do has changed quite a bit in the United States, and it's not a coincidence that teachers' unions in particular have been at the center of this new wave of municipalism. So they can exercise various forms of political economic power. There's a solidarity economies movement, which is quite extensive in the United States now, although still very grassroots, doesn't have any state support. We have, of course, very deep neighborhood and community forms of associational power. I'll reference Chicago again, and Jane Addams and her work. A much more radical municipalist program is to be found in Jane Addams' writings than is often acknowledged. You've seen the widespread adoption and reintroduction of different forms of assemblies, whether we're talking about actual popular assemblies or citizen assemblies or other forms of assemblies. And then efforts that I'm particularly involved with around universities and institutions to bring technical, cultural, and economic power to bear, something that in Wisconsin we call the Wisconsin idea. So let's go from this trajectory that I was sort of laying out in terms of the rise of not only municipal socialism as a particular way of organizing and building community power, but also this broader sort of burgeoning possibility of community power in the US, to the moment in which we live. And of course, this is the floor of the House of Representatives on January 6th of 2020, right? And what does it mean for community power to be emerging as a real possibility in the US at the very same time in which the national government is proving to lack the capacity to govern in a stable way, right? We had sort of a moment in which there was a sense that perhaps there could be a return to normalcy, although everybody that I know in the US said there is no return to normalcy, there's no going back, we don't want to go back. But that was that Biden moment. And now everybody that I'm talking with is looking to the year ahead, and particularly the next 6 months. And these are questions that are asked by serious people. And when I say serious people, I mean people with whom probably all of us disagree in the pages of the New York Times and Washington Post and so on. And the serious questions are, will the November elections take place? Will there be congressional elections that take place? Will we even get there? And if there are elections, will the election results take effect? In other words, if various states return the results that are expected in this midterm election, in which there is clearly a wave that has been building that would produce a different Congress, will those elected members of Congress be allowed to take office? I know I'm coming up on time, so I'll move more quickly. As I said, will the new Congress actually take office? I can get into the specific questions that have to do with House rules and the lack of any kind of provision in the Constitution of the United States for transition of power in Congress, if people are interested. In that situation in which Congress is at an impasse and, say, contending Congresses, will the president govern unilaterally? Well, what do you think? Will the United States remain united? What will happen in a country in which the majority of people have 2/3 of the population is opposed to the trajectory of the government in Washington, and yet they don't have representation? Those are some of the questions that we're taking on. As I mentioned earlier, we have this project that we are involved with called Next System Studies at George Mason University. We both have a Next System Studies program and a Center for Next System Studies. And one of our projects is the Community Power Project. And so what we have been focused on, I'm going to tell you a little bit about, but I'll just say that we're in a place where we've been focused on building community power for the long haul, but we find ourselves in a situation in which we are facing national rupture in the immediate term. And so we've been paying attention to community defense networks in different parts of the country, the possibilities of municipal government sort of stepping into the breach, and we've seen through greater coordination between major cities. We're paying attention to the relationship between municipalities and the state governments, because the states in the United States do have not only constitutional power that is significant, but substantive constitutional power, which is to say they actually have their own capacities, even in real terms. And the question of coordination and counterpower. So the basic question here, just to put it bluntly, is in a situation in which the federal government is being governed unilaterally without any sort of role from Congress, right? Where there is a unitary executive that is, another word for that is dictatorship. What is the role of communities in that moment? And arguably, communities have proven the most significant centers for resistance to authoritarianization in the United States. And so the question is, what can be done in the short term to enable them to provide an alternative in a moment of rupture? There's also the longer term agenda, which is sort of more central to what we do at Next System Studies, which has to do with the possibility that not only in a moment of national rupture, but in this longer term period in which we're experiencing a global collapse of a world system. It's been a longer term process in which we've been faced with a choice between global capital and the nation state as providing a foundation for the world system. We might want to choose communities as the alternative foundation for a world system. So is there a possibility for a deepened municipalism joining with solidarity economies, with the digital commoner movement, with various forms of popular and revolutionary constitutionalism, with what I mentioned earlier, the Wisconsin idea, which is to say universities and other institutions acting as agents of social reconstruction to produce a new world system in which communities are at the center of that world system. So that's what we're working on. I won't read all of this to you, but basically what we have been doing is we're building out a project that involves local research teams coming out of communities all across the US, across the Americas. We've been building networks to assess the possibilities, the strengths of community power that are already there and the absences, and also to strengthen linkages. And the role of universities in this process is to help to coordinate and to stabilize, to provide institutional power, to provide reflection. And so this is one of our major projects. It's also related to this project is bolstered by one of our other major projects right now, which are the Next System teach-ins. We had a wave of teach-ins. This is to say sort of mass popular education and engagement events that are designed to focus attention on a particular question, to bring the attention of the entire community, the entire university community, or an entire municipal community, as much as possible on a particular question. For us, that question is the question of system change, the system question. And so these are coordinated teach-ins. They happen in multiple places, roughly at the same time. There was a wave of them that took place this past November at 11 sites from Buenos Aires up to Toronto, Mexico, Puerto Rico, and across the US. And we have another wave that's coming in April of 2027. And want to invite all of you to take part of that. And we see the teach-ins as helping to build the kinds of relationships and understandings that are necessary for strengthening community power, and also to build the kinds of relationships and understandings that are necessary for building the participation of people in academia in building community power and in building other kinds of sources of an alternative world system. So I know I went over time and I apologize. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to hearing from Hillary and talking with all of you.
Thanks so much, Ben. That was brilliant. Okay, Hillary.
Okay, well, first, thanks to Caris and Simon and and Ben as the organisers, and secondly, to say that both contributions have been brilliant, and I particularly related to what Nura was saying about Porto Alegre, because like many sort of new leftists, I followed it for a period, and I just got two images that really reinforce what Nura said. So I remember going near the beginning and going to a really, mass meeting where people, it wasn't just that it was open to everybody, but people were there through their movements, through their organizations, and it had a real kind of sense of popular power. And then I can't remember how many years later, but probably 5 or 6, I remember going again. Well, I went a lot in between, but I remember going to a really almost sad meeting where it was individual citizens facing an official who simply it wasn't an accountability session. It was more the official using the remaining very residual framework of participatory democracy to communicate the message of the council to the citizens. So the process that Nura described really echoed with me. So I haven't done slides, and I've just got notes. So in a way, for me, I don't refer to community power, I refer to popular power, to contrast it with parliamentary power. Maybe that's because Britain is such a parliamentary system, or strong, well, not strong, but kind of, ideologically parliamentary. And indeed, in the experience of city struggles over the past 50 years, popular power has been necessary to overcome the limits of parliamentary power, which after all is based on representative democracy, and representation is based on citizens as the atomized voter, whereas popular power entails citizens as organized, as a source of collective power and shared capacity. So the distinctive, maybe this is the British experience, the distinctive feature of the past 50 years has been the use of parliamentary office, the election of left officials, to stimulate and support popular power. so it wasn't really, it's not been the emphasis on participation, although there has been those experiences sort of imitating Porto Alegre in a rather weak way. But rather, the first experience that influenced me and in which I was directly involved was at the Greater London Council, where we we didn't focus on participation. We literally started a unit called the Popular Planning Unit. And the purpose of that unit was not to encourage participation, specifically not, very purposefully not to ask the citizens to come into the council, but rather to use the resources of the council, of the material resources, purchasing resources, control over land, control over funding, to actually support social movements and support collective power. So that was the context of the Popular Planning Unit, and its sole purpose was to stimulate and support the building of popular power, as against the weakness of representative democracy. We did this through several means. One was what we called economic literacy. So it was an emphasis on, excuse my voice, I'm in the middle of chemo, so I'm slightly flaky. So we used a kind of whole strategy of economic literacy, we called it, or, popular education, using existing institutions of adult education, but converting them into educational resources for popular movements. And then we would get directly involved in existing struggles. So our theory was where there's resistance, there's implicitly and explicitly a vision that things could be different, a vision of an alternative within that resistance. So, at the very beginning, we didn't, instead of involving the citizens in the municipality, we would identify where in London there were struggles that we could support. So I remember, there was a struggle in Docklands, which is the context is that Margaret Thatcher had abolished all planning regulation. So the Docklands was this very near the City of London, very rich, very valuable land, and there were no planning regulations, and there was a company wanting to start an airport, in the middle of near the city, so it's called the City Airport. So it was like a kind of, corporate airport, but it was in the middle of a working class community that had been neglected and ignored and was very poor. So I heard about this meeting there about opposing what they call the Stolport, the short landing and takeoff airport. Anyway, so I went there and simply listened to them, and went with a colleague from the Popular Planning Unit, and we would say, so what's your alternative? And they just immediately started saying, well, we'd like to have a centre where we could bring together our ideas, a people's plan centre. And they came up with all these different ideas, which we could then go back to the Greater London Council and say, we need to support these developments. So we supported a people's plan centre, and then the people, and then we gave them enough money to employ people. They did the choosing of the people, and then they would those people that they chose, so they would choose like a local school leaver, a local businessman, a local trade unionist, and those people would then go round the community to gather ideas and alternatives. So they would go to bingo sessions and, just every kind of collective gathering, whether it was a social movement or simply the community coming together. And then they developed a plan called the People's Plan for the Royal Docks, which they then got the GLC to distribute to all the people in that area. And I remember there was then an inquiry into the airport. And I remember the lawyer, for the other side, for the airport, he got hold of the plan, and he said, a people's plan, I've never heard of such a thing, like completely mocking it. Anyway, in the end, the inquiry led to a diminishing of the scope of the airport, and was a kind of victory. I mean, it didn't stop the airport, but it almost stopped it being viable. So, I mean, now it still exists, but it's a very, very small kind of airport. And then another example was a place called Coin Street. I don't know if people know London, they might know Coin Street. It's in the centre of London, just by the Thames, very desirable sort of, place for apartments and this kind of thing. And the people there got organized to campaign against it. And they similarly developed their own alternative plan, which then the GLC gave funding to, which included, small solidarity economy, a kind of completely reorganization of the use of the land, and above all, the use of council powers of expropriation to buy that land for the community, to be run by the community, and to block the speculative office development. So those are two examples from the days of the Greater London Council, which was quite a historic time. Ben will remember. But then came Mrs. Thatcher, and her deputy, Norman Tebbit, said, "This is modern socialism and we must kill it." And they did. They abolished the GLC, which is kind of, unthinkable in many other countries to abolish a municipality. Anyway, that happened. And then, I mean, the memory has lived on to a degree. I mean, it's always the question of memory, I think, is important, and keeping a memory like that alive, a memory that they wanted to delete. They wanted to abolish the reality and delete the memory. So that's been, an important project, keeping that memory alive and learning from it. So community wealth building, which Ben referred to, is kind of a use of that experience, because it's, in a way, community wealth building is using the powers of a municipality, particularly the purchasing powers, and to some degree the land use powers, to support an alternative economy. So that still exists. It's weak, partly because, of a hostile government, whether it's Thatcher or New Labour. And now we have, as Ben said, or maybe Carrie said, the development of, the support for the Greens, which is a kind of expression of discontent with Starmer and, the established Labour Party. And, we haven't really analysed the Greens in depth, but certainly it's led to one or two really good socialist mayors, like in my area, Hackney. I just heard her speak once, and she says all these different things. She says, we must use purchasing power, we must use land use power, we must use every public power to support community action and popular power. So there I wouldn't call it a kind of, what did you use a phrase of, you said something about rays of sun or something. It's not quite a ray of sun, but it's a possibility. So I think maybe I've not got much more to say, but I think the emphasis is on popular power versus representative democracy, and on using municipal powers, but without romanticizing them, to develop that popular power. And I think, the idea of the other power we used was the power of grant giving. There was a sort of, I don't know, maybe this was the radical GLC introduced quite a radical program of giving grants. So grants would be given to local resource centres, so local popular planning centres. And so again, the emphasis is on, very much backing up what Nura said, very much about using the municipality to stimulate and support popular power, not to get the people to participate in the existing system. So short and I hope sweet.
That was brilliant. Thank you, Hilary. Thanks.
But I can answer any questions.
Really, really, really great to hear about the GLC, and I love what you're saying about memory. Okay, so we've got like half an hour or so for people to, maybe we could start with some questions and then move on to more of a freer discussion. Who has some questions? Okay, maybe we'll take a couple and then give some answers. So Simon, go ahead.
So can people online hear me from here, or should I stand near the
Can you hear, guys?
We can. Yeah, if you speak up, we can hear.
I mean, I can maybe stand near the mic. That should be a bit better. I don't know if you can see me, but
it's good.
Cool. Yeah. So a question for you, Ben, because it wasn't really foregrounded in your presentation, but I know and you know that your PhD was on sort of the radical constitutional imaginaries of the United States, amongst other places. I'm afraid I haven't read the full PhD. Maybe it'd be weird if I said that I had. I always find it weird when people say they've read the rare occasions when people say they've read my PhD, it feels like they're stalking me or something. But I've looked at it, I've skimmed it, and I'm a bit more familiar with that constitutional history of the United States through, what's his name, Aziz Rana, who did a great 4-part series on the Dig podcast, running through the what was quite amazing to me, learning about it for the first time, this actual radical constitutional imaginary that has been there in United States radical politics for a long, long time, until what, like the 70s-ish?
That's about right.
When it takes on this new character in the title of Aziz's book. You know, it becomes this kind of sanctified, ossified thing that everyone kind of accepts that you can't change, or maybe you shouldn't change. And so my question is there any hint now of a re-emergent radical constitutional imaginary? Are any of the contemporary US movements starting to talk about constitutional amendment, reform, a new constituent process, or anything like that? Because it would seem like the right time, right? The Constitution is clearly failing, but then maybe at the same time, people are so focused on survival and you know, having the next elections at all, as you mentioned, for that to be a factor. So I'm curious whether that's come back up or not.
Thank you.
Do you want to answer it, or do you want to take another question? If it's easier, you could just answer it.
Yeah, it might be easier.
Yeah.
Might be easier. Is that okay with the two of you, Nara?
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Yeah, thank you for that setup, Simon. I appreciate it. And yeah, the dissertation is a collection of articles that are woven together, but I'm working on a book under contract called Constitutional Revolution, which I could speak about another time. But yeah, I would say that in the United States, it's definitely correct that following a wave in the 1970s with the People's Constitutional Convention convened by the Black Panther Party, among others, second wave feminism, there was a Women's Constitutional Convention in the late 1970s, and of course the Equal Rights Amendment re-emerging after over 100 years of efforts in the U.S. Into the early 1980s. Then the sort of engagement of democratic forces in the United States in popular constitutionalism subsided, and the field was occupied by the right, and they developed a strong constitutional agenda around a so-called balanced budget amendment, anti-immigrant amendments, a right to life amendment, and those actually, I could get into the history of those as well, but they have not succeeded yet, right? Let's just put it that way. So what I would say is that in the United States, in the last 25 years, you have seen the re-entry to the field of constitutional reform and perhaps constitutional renewal by the democracy movement and the broader social movement in the US in a very significant way. The first major step in that was following the debacle of 2000, the Florida 2000 recount, which was stopped, in which following that, a number of us organized something called Democracy Summer in Tallahassee in Florida. Jamie Raskin was then a law professor at American University. Some of you may know of him now as a member of Congress who led the impeachment proceedings against President Trump. And he has an excellent book that I recommend called Overruling Democracy. from his days in which he was primarily a law professor. But a number of us came together and organized this conference that came out of that produced something called the Voter Bill of Rights. Alongside of that, Representative Jesse Jackson Jr. of Chicago introduced a right to vote amendment. There is no constitutional right to vote that is expressed directly in the Constitution of the United States. So that was sort of the first push for constitutional change that came out of the social movement that was quite significant. Then in 2006, with the Day Without an Immigrant, the sort of first major wave of millions of people out on strike and out in the streets for immigrant worker rights, you saw the immigrant rights movement begin to push for a constitutional change. That has since lagged, but they have an agenda that comes out of the National Network for Immigration Reform. And then in 2010, most significantly, I think what really opened up but has basically meant the rejoining of the broader movement into the constitutional field was a prepared response to the Citizens United v. FEC decision, the decision that basically unleashed this era in which you have billions and billions of dollars being spent in U.S. elections. And a number of us saw that decision coming and began organizing about 8 months out. And on the day in which the Supreme Court decision came down, introduced the motion to amend and the Move to Amend coalition. The Move to Amend is still around, and our response involved, interestingly, a bottom-up process. So beginning in my hometown of Madison, we collected 22,000 signatures to put a ballot measure on the ballot, calling for a amendment making clear that corporations do not have the rights of persons, and that the use of money was not a form of protected free speech. So that became the We the People Amendment. That passed with 80% of the vote through a popular vote. That became our model for getting similar resolutions passed in hundreds of other cities and states by popular vote. Chicago, Los Angeles, Wyoming, Montana, Hawaii, and hundreds of small communities and larger cities passed this. And that has become the We the People Amendment that has nearly 100 sponsors in the U.S. House of Representatives. Move to Amend is still at that. Then you saw the renewal of the push for the Equal Rights Amendment. Virginia, the state I now live in, was the 38th state to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, which has still not been put on the books. Biden could have done that, but it has been ratified by the requisite number of states. And you've seen other amendments that have been pushed. So there's a whole series of amendments that have been introduced in Congress that come out of the social movement that have broad popular support. What I would just say about this in terms of the discussion around community power is I'm in this strange position where over the last 10 to 15 years, having been a strong advocate for a new constitution in the United States for a long time. I used to edit a journal called the Liberty Tree Journal. We had an entire issue on the question 20 years ago. I see this work as very important, but I actually think that the primary focus should be on municipal constitutions, charter reform, and on coordination among municipalities translocally around a global constitutional framework. That what we actually need to do is bring together community power efforts and efforts at popular constitutional renewal, and use constitutionalism to accomplish what has always been so radical about it from the very beginning, which is the act of articulation. The collective act of articulation is an act that calls into question all existing power relations. And so if we are talking about designing a next world system and building a global movement that has the capacity of bringing about a transition to that world system, then constitutionalism is an essential strategy for us, because we must involve billions of people, ideally, certainly hundreds of million at the minimum, in the design of that system. And I can get into, in my research, my primary personal research focuses on why constitutional change matters so much. I feel like I've used all my time for responding to questions, so I hope others will be directed to my co-panelists. But thank you, Simon.
Thanks. Okay, let's.
Can I ask you a question, Ben? Well, I don't know. It's not a question, but it's a sort of. I'm amazed by everything you've said because there's nothing, no reporting of this in certainly in Britain, maybe not in Europe. And I'm just, well, I mean, in one sense, I'm wondering why, and certainly I'll be contacting you after to write for Red Pepper. But it is, I mean, there's nothing, absolutely nothing, you know, I've not in the Guardian or anywhere. Is there any sense of this kind of new municipalism, of any kind of movement? You know, you just think the States was Trump and you know, a bit of muttering against Trump, but nothing like a movement. And I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, there have been, so Jacobin, which represents a particular set of
Yes,
currents,
Jacobin, of
and,
course.
has covered this, the Progressive magazine in these times. And one thing, as you know, when I last visited with you, I think it was actually around the last AFPP, Hillary, you know, I think it would be really powerful if Red Pepper and the Progressive and Il Manifesto and La Jornada and so on could strengthen their relationships. And we really, you know, 25 years ago, we had a very strong independent media movement in the US, of course, and then that produced indie media, came out of the Seattle uprising. And we've lost that. And so I think you're right. And one problem we have in the US is, of course, that you know, we have no major media in the United States that is popularly owned. The Chicago Sun-Times is the best case now. It's labor owned in Chicago, major nutpaper. I like they should be part of this.
What's it called? The
Chicago Sun-Times, which was one of the two dailies. It's one of the two dailies in Chicago. Was bought by the labor movement a number of years ago and plays an important role. But yes.
Okay, well, let's follow that up. I'm seeing Luciana from your manifesto maybe tomorrow.
Okay, next questions. Okay, I will ask a question. So I really enjoyed the theme that was coming out of both Hillary and Nara's talks about it not being about participation and it being about and I loved how you when you talked about the popular planning unit, Hillary, that it wasn't about engaging people. It was about using that space to, you know, support and foster and grow already existing sources of popular power. Is that I guess, like, is that how you'd understand it? And and I mean, could it be, could someone critique it and say that's undemocratic? I mean, what's the sort of, how could you sort of how could you defend that against attack that's tethered to a sort of democratic decision about what we want to be supported?
Yes, I mean, hang on. Yeah, no, I'm not muted. Yes, I mean, I think we did consider that question of our legitimacy, because we were a bit like a sort of democratic vanguard. You know, we would be identifying the people to support. I mean, and I suppose we did that. Our democratic legitimacy came really from the manifesto of the GLC. So the radical leadership, Ken Livingstone and his comrades, they before they got into office, they developed a very detailed manifesto, which they consulted people in the Labour Party and so on. But it was very detailed. And so, for example, with the docks, they had a commitment in the manifesto to ending the kind of imperial Port of London docks, and instead developing a kind of more modest European dock facility. So we were able to take that commitment and then turn that into the basis of a popular power movement in the docks. So that enabled us to go to the municipality and get the money and get the resources. So I think having that detailed manifesto that was then supported through the parliamentary process then gave a sort of legitimacy to the delegated power of the popular planning unit. So, you know, we had that sort of, if you like, electoral mandate. And in a way, we were kind of, you could say that we were making that mandate happen, because without popular planning and the popular power that we helped to develop, then the Thatcher's undemocratic appropriation of land and imposition of the airport would have won. So in a way, we changed the balance of power between democracy and kind of economic authoritarianism.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree. I just I've tried. I can't quite formulate the question, but what I was thinking in both of your talks is it's almost like the participatory budgeting, the way it's been done in this very individualized, a citizens way, does potentially generate good decisions. It's just not building popular power, isn't it? So it's not a bulwark against authoritarianism or other. It doesn't address power, does it? But
no.
It does. But it does work from a kind of liberal, deliberative democracy perspective, which shouldn't be discarded. I don't think you throw the baby out with the bathwater. You do want to have good decision making. I just wondered if Nara, you as well, wondered if you sort of saw it as having those two different sides, like good decision making as well as wanting to build up popular power, and maybe they're like two logics that you want to be incorporating into system design. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think that's actually, no, I understand. I think I understood your question. You correct me if I go in the wrong direction. I think there is something about when I say that I think it's important, I want to advance the idea that participation requires actually collective actors as well. I don't think it's actually to pose in opposition here, individualized participation or collective actors based participation. I think maybe it's a way of actually thinking about how these two can work together. Because what I see though in the process of participatory budgeting is that one was totally forgotten, right? So like if you allow me to actually share my slide again. So as I said, I think that there was actually, here when you see this very simplified figure here of participatory budgeting, you do have the budget council, right? And here the budget forum that actually has, when you have the delegates, but you see these other elements here, right? This is all for neighborhood associations, so these channels existed. But throughout the process, these areas here that are rounded, they were forgotten. And I think that what I want is to actually think of ways in which both can work together. And I think that actually something that we need to counter is very much the neoliberal perspective that actually thinks that anything that is related just to the individual is the most democratic thing, So I think that what unfortunately happened with participatory budgeting was to say that if you go there, you individually, and participate, that is more democratic than anything else. And I think that we need to question this logic, right? The neoliberal perspective of participation needs to be we need to counter that. And I think that there might be ways in which that you can that you can participate as an individual, but should also be ways in which that actually associations, organizations, movements have a say, precisely because in the long run, right? I think that that's something, a lesson that you can actually get from other movements as well. In the long run, individual-based participation actually cannot be sustained. Right, at least not in capitalism as it exists. So people get tired. People have other commitments. People have jobs. So social movements, organizations, they are actually, they are the ones that actually can help the process in the long run. So I think that's what I would say. I'm not sure if it answers, because I think also like what I have a lot in mind also is like the process, the way that it developed in Venezuela as well, in which you did have, room for specific organizations to participate, not simply individuals,
I think, can I add one thing, which is the importance of knowledge and different kinds of knowledge. So I think there's an important distinction, an obvious distinction between, codified and scientific knowledge and sort of practical and tacit knowledge, and that the forms of representative democracy they only deal with codified and scientific knowledge. They you know, they kind of develop policies that are developed within the state, whereas through involving popular power, you're really enabling the sharing of tacit knowledge, you know, which is obviously fundamental. I mean, both to good decision making and to popular power. And I think that knowledge dimension needs to be built in a bit more into our thinking about popular power, and sort of understanding popular power as being about sharing tacit knowledge as distinct from the, if you like, individualism of codified knowledge being implemented through existing institutions. So we need institutions that share social tacit knowledge.
Is it sort of about consciousness raising as well, in a way that the sort of more democratic thing doesn't quite do? Is that one way you'd look at it?
Yes, consciousness raising is important. I mean, and is a way, in a sense, you could say with the women's movement, consciousness raising was a way of sharing tacit knowledge. You know, it was those consciousness raising groups were the ways in which people would share their experiences and develop knowledge from interrogating and sharing experiences that were a source of tacit knowledge. I mean, tacit knowledge is embedded in experience.
We've got a question from Simon.
Unless anyone else wants
Unless anyone else would like to go in first. Okay.
Okay, I'll try and project from here this time instead of standing up. So I think this is a question that maybe suits going to Nara first, but I'd love to hear what Hilary and Ben have to say about it as well at this time. And I guess the core of the question, Nara, is like, maybe it's the obvious question. Okay, what kind of collective actor do we want, or actors who try to be that counter power or popular power? And for context, you know, that I see a lot of synergy here with my own case study in municipalism in Madrid that I was talking about this morning, and in my PhD, and loads of synergies. For example, they did manage to implement some participatory budgeting, and that was widely criticized from the kind of the left, shall we say, or the more radical or horizontalist parts of the movement, for exactly the things you say, being very individualizing, very technocratic, very limited in scope. And I think, yeah, you framed, you know, the common critique of that process in Madrid really well, talking about Porto Alegre. On the other hand, the more radical kind of initial municipalist movement in Madrid was really resistant to a certain type of collective actor, which was the political party. So I talked this morning about this logic of confluence. And I say this is a space of confluence, this is a space of individuals, singularities coming together into a new whole, not a space for representatives of other groups, other parties to come and proselytize and sell their newspapers and try and, you know, hold the party line, etc. Subsequently, when in power, they had to form a kind of coalition with Podemos, and then you had all these splits between the different councillors in power, and like some of the more radical councillors talked a lot about counterpower. So then they looked to the municipalist movement, which was more kind of a figment of their imagination than reality after a certain point of exhaustion. But they looked to building a municipalist movement as a counterpower. So that was the collective actor. But the most interesting thing, I think, that was in the early proposals, and this is kind of the nub of my question for everyone, and I skipped over this morning, so this is new for anyone who was here this morning. An early proposal they had that they never got to implement was a kind of electoral dual power strategy. So inspired by the Zapatista Juntas de Buen Gobierno, they wanted to implement Juntas de Buen Gobierno in Madrid as these kind of autonomous centers of citizen participation and self-management that was explicitly framed a couple of times as a dual power strategy, using the resources of the municipal state to set up this dual power organization that, like, if it follows a dual power strategy, right, it's going to rival and try and actually undermine and replace the very municipal state that created it. And of course, this goes back to Mari Bookchin, who I think was the first really to explicitly proposed this strategy, and then they proposed it in Madrid and never implemented it. And it seemed like such a kind of contradictory, a kind of almost oxymoron strategy, but an interestingly contradictory strategy. So I'm curious what everyone thinks about this electoral dual power strategy, and you in particular, Nara, what you think about that as a form of collective actor versus the other alternatives.
Yeah, thanks for this question. I think it's an excellent one. I think actually touches also. I think because I think it helps actually move the debate a little bit forward because. For sure, right? So like what, if we want to criticize the neoliberal individualized model of participation, so then as you said, what kind of collective actor should actually be part of this? And if you remember from the presentation, from my presentation, I said at one point, right, that there was actually space for collective actors, and this is space originally in Porto Alegre, and this space was actually diminished, right? And there was an option to actually privilege the budget forums that actually would have individual representatives, and the people would come and vote as individuals. And I think this is also part of the specific history in which participatory budgeting emerged, in which you did have clashes among political powers, right? Political parties, sorry, right? So the Workers' Party was actually emerging as an alternative and trying to actually fight foci of cronism, really, that actually you did have across the state, Rio Grande do Sul, right, in the city. So there was a way of actually, like the turn towards the individual in the original project was also a way of avoiding very much the instrumentalization of the process by political parties. So I don't think that the choice was totally nonsense back then, right? But in a more like dialectical analysis, right, you can see that the process was undermined by its own forces. So then later on, what was initially a strength, right, the individual, the participation of individuals and not only of organizations became a weakness, right? So first, it made sense. Later on, it created the conditions for its own demise. And I think that that's the question that we then have to consider. So then, like, which type of collective actors we're going to welcome? I obviously don't want to actually demonize political parties or well-established organization. I think there is a danger in doing that. And I think like what Ben said earlier, right, that there was an involvement here in the United States, and then like, oh, let's depoliticize the process, by removing political parties. I think that that's a problem. So I don't want to demonize that. What I want to propose instead is actually to think of like, well, if the point is to actually think about creating or enabling like meaningful transformation in people's lives, right? I think we actually then have to think about even collective actors in ways that we are not used to think, right? So if the point is to think, for example, well, we do need better education, right? So like, how about actually thinking about routes for parents and teachers associations, right? So how about actually thinking of universities? Like, why do we think about universities actually having a say in decision-making processes that are, that pertain to our municipalities? Like, I think that I think it's less about like creating new collective actors, but actually making the collective actors that already exist political, if that makes sense. I think that actually that it's a more of a way of politicizing everyday life than actually having a specific role for unions or for neighborhood associations or for, like, they are already there. So why not actually thinking about, well, if there is, if we think about like new workers legislations, yes, it makes sense to talk about unions, right? But if we are thinking about transit, right? So maybe other association makes more sense to actually have a say. So I think it's less about creating, it's more about recreating, redefining, repurposing, right? Because then, because I think it does. Otherwise, we can actually fall in another trap, which is to actually make a system like very rigid and create much more bureaucracy, right? Like bureaucratize something. So yeah, I would say that. I don't know what Hillary and Ben think of this. I think it's actually a great question. Thanks for posing it.
Myself. Okay. No, I agree. It's a very good question. And I think I'd answer it, well, agreeing very much with Nura and then adding, in a way, the repurposing of all public institutions. So one thing that we did at the GLC was with universities, we didn't sort of, talk about participation. We created centers of expertise, kind of almost like repurposing the university so that there was a center for IT, for I don't know, I can't remember the different centers we had, but those were centers that could be resources for popular movements. So it was like taking every institution and saying, how could it become a resource instead of being a source of domination? How could it become a resource for the development of popular power?
Yeah. I want to go into that question, and maybe I'll come back to it, Hillary, around the role of universities and academia and all of this. So I'll try to come back to that. But I also very much appreciate the question. I think that there is an implicit tension and oftentimes conflict between popular power and institutional power, of course, and that's what you're speaking to. And the question for me then becomes, how do we build that tension into a creative one and a driving one, rather than into something that isolates us or limits us? And so you mentioned earlier Murray Bookchin, and I read Murray Bookchin when I was a teenager, and was certainly influenced by some of his ideas. But I also came to recognize that, to be very frank, many of them are not his ideas. And this is sort of a little bit of a difficulty, I think, for social ecology, which I've raised with various people over the years, which is that there's always something that's new and creative in a ideological tradition, but it's also important to recognize how much has been borrowed, and there's a failure to do that. I'm sorry, but social ecology is a failure to acknowledge how much has been adopted from the practical work of people in struggle. So I mentioned earlier in the 1970s the various municipal parties that were built in places like also Burlington, Vermont, where he was situated, and Ann Arbor and Madison and Berkeley and Somerville and so on. And they had people were struggling with the same question of, how do we make participatory democracy real? And so in my hometown, for example, in the 1970s, when Paul Soglin was elected mayor for the first time and erected a banner in City Hall that said, "We know who won the Vietnam War," and blew the flag of the National Liberation Front in City Hall, and that was in the front page of the New York Times. Midwest City elects red mayor. It wasn't. There was a lot of sort of rhetorical, militant rhetoric and so on, but there was also pragmatically, a project of reconstruction. So thousands of seats were created in committees for citizens of the city to become officers of the city to propose policy, and it remains the case that out of those committees come policies that the city council votes on. Right, that was a transformation. The city built community action centers and funded them. So not just community centers, but community action centers that were staffed and in order to support popular power, right? The community centers were expanded and reorganized. There was the pedestrianization of much of the downtown of the city, the reconstruction of much of the physical infrastructure of the city to enable more, to create more space for popular participation, the construction of a civic center in downtown Madison. These were all things that were done in coordination and influenced by what was happening in Bologna, what was happening in Yugoslavia, what was happening in Cuba. So I guess what I would say is, we can have an ideal type around assemblies and municipalism and what radical municipalism is, and that's useful and conceptually, but we need to focus on the real types. How do organizations like Democratic Socialists of America, the most significant socialist organization to emerge in this country in generations, right? Over quite an interesting set of developments over the last, basically my lifetime. How is that, with multiple different kinds of tendencies? How do we treat such an organization? We might treat it critically, but how do we engage with it, or do we just stand aside and sort of operate in our own imaginary world? How do we engage with unions and union power and the reality that teachers unions and other unions, public sector unions in particular, have transformed, and that there's struggles that have gone on with them that have actually produced meaningful changes in the situation in this country? If it weren't for the union I grew up, Madison Teachers, I grew up in that union, or the Chicago Teachers Union, or the American Federation of Teachers, and the MTA in Massachusetts, and these various unions in Los Angeles and Philadelphia, DC, and all these cities, we would be in we'd be in a much lesser position than we are right now. So I think that is the real challenge, right? That is the challenge: is how do we get from here to there, and how do we operate in a way that is very strategic, is oriented towards where we need to go, but is also pluralist and a little bit humble. And so that's where perhaps universities can come in. Universities are not known for being humble, but we can play particular roles. We can play convening roles for communities. We can play a significant role in terms of resourcing for popular planning and participation. We can play roles in terms of providing some stability and coordinating across space, right? And that's part of what we're working to do through Next System Studies, is to build an international field and various networks and organizations in which faculty in Buenos Aires and Mexico City and San Juan and Cape Town and Manchester and Glasgow and Northern Virginia are working together with people in our communities, and we're able to assist in this process of building meaningful municipalism and meaningful community power.